The general manager of the Meridian Club seized Ramona Solis by the wrist before she could push through the door to the private dining room. "Whatever you're thinking," Stafford Lyle said through his teeth. "Don't." Ramona looked down at his hand, then back up at him. Through the door, she could already hear it, the clatter of silverware, a young server's voice, stuttering apologies, Stafford's assistant hissing instructions, and beneath all of that, the sound she'd learned to identify after 2 years of working the back office of the most connected supper club in the city. Silence. The deliberate kind. The kind a room full of dangerous men made when they were waiting to see what happened next. "Someone might be hurt," she said. Stafford's grip tightened. "Someone's career is definitely finished if you walk through that door." She walked through the door. The scene inside had gone perfectly wrong. A serving cart had clipped the edge of the table during a turn, sending a tureen of lobster bisque skidding across white linen. The soup hadn't hit a guest. By some narrow mercy, the cart had jerked sideways at the last moment, but a wave of hot broth had sloshed across the table's edge, inches from where Flavia Sato's forearm rested. Flavia Sato did not flinch. She did not gasp. She sat exactly as she had been sitting, upright, composed, hands folded, while the young server responsible stood frozen behind the overturned cart, white as hotel stationery, and Stafford's assistant circled the room like a man trying to decide whether to apologize or simply disappear. Every person in the room knew who Flavia Sato was. She was the reason her son's name carried weight in 3 states. She was the reason the mayor of this city had once delayed a press conference to take her phone call. She was the reason that when the Sato family requested a private dining room at the Meridian Club, the entire floor was quietly cleared and a secondary kitchen crew was called in. She had never raised her voice in public. She had never needed to. Ramona had only come through to deliver amended quarterly statements to the club's director. Documents Stafford had been demanding for 2 days, and she had walked straight into the worst possible moment. She should have backed out. She knew she should have backed out. Instead, she set the file folder quietly on the nearest credenza and crossed the room toward Flavia Sato's chair. No one stopped her. No one moved at all. She crouched slightly beside the table, low enough to bring herself to Flavia's eye level, and looked at the older woman's arm where the broth had come closest. "Mrs. Sato," she said quietly, "are you burned?" The room held its breath. Flavia turned her head and looked at Ramona Solis for the first time. Her eyes were dark and precise, the eyes of a woman who had spent 67 years reading rooms and people and the distance between what someone said and what they meant. She looked at Ramona the way she looked at everything. Completely, without hurry. Ramona didn't look away. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was simpler than that. She was genuinely asking. "No," Flavia said. Her voice was even unhurried. "I wasn't burned." "I'm relieved." Ramona glanced at the server still frozen behind the cart, a kid named Danny who had started 6 weeks ago and had, until 30 seconds ago, been doing well. "Soup can be mopped up. Skin takes longer." It was a ridiculous thing to say. She knew it was ridiculous the moment it left her mouth. She was not a philosopher. She was the woman who had spent the last 2 years in a basement office, reconciling invoices for a supper club that catered to people she mostly tried not to think about too hard. But Flavia Sato's expression shifted, barely, the way the light shifts at the edge of late afternoon, into something that might, in another face, have become a smile. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ramona Solis. I'm the bookkeeper. I wasn't supposed to be in here at all. But you came in. Someone needed to ask." Stafford Lyle had materialized at the dining room threshold. His face had cycled through 4 different colors in the span of 30 seconds. "Mrs. Sato, on behalf of the Meridian Club, I want to express our absolute..." "Thank you, Mr. Lyle." Flavia's tone was not unkind, It was simply final. She turned back to Ramona. The young man who spilled the soup, is this his fault? Ramona considered the question honestly. The cart has a wheel that sticks. I've logged it twice in maintenance requests. It should have been replaced 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed filled itself with implication. Stafford's color shifted again. Flavia nodded once, with the gravity of someone who had just received exactly the information she needed. She looked toward Danny, who had gone from white to a kind of pale grey. "The cart, not your hands," she said to him. "Clean it up carefully." "Yes, ma'am," he barely got the words out. Ramona stood and smoothed her skirt. She picked up the folder from the credenza and set it beside Stafford without looking at him. "Your quarterly statements," she said, and left. She did not look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back only invited comparison between where you were and where you thought you should be. Neither was ever useful. What Ramona didn't see, as she returned to the basement office and her rows of carefully organized spreadsheets, was Flavia Sato watching the door close behind her for several long seconds. Thoughtful, still. She also didn't see Emilio Sato arrive 20 minutes later, apologizing briefly to his mother for the delay, taking his seat at the far end of the table, and noticing almost immediately that his mother looked different. Not dramatically, just lighter. The particular kind of lighter that came from encountering something unexpected and good. "Something happened before I arrived," he said to her quietly, when the conversation around them turned to other things. "A small incident," she said. And a bookkeeper with more sense than anyone else in this building." Emilio didn't press. His mother finished her dinner for the first time in months, and that, for now, was enough. By Monday morning, the Meridian Club staff had heard 4 different versions of what had happened in the private dining room. In all 4 versions, Ramona Solis had said something extraordinary to Flavia Sato and had somehow walked out unscathed. In 2 of the versions, Flavia had smiled. In one, Danny had burst into grateful tears in the break room. Ramona wished they would all stop talking about it. She had a backlog of vendor reconciliations and a payroll audit due by Thursday. She did not have time to be a story. But stories, once started, rarely cared about convenience. Yvette Hollins had worked the Meridian Club's floor for 6 years. She knew every regular guest's preferred table, every seasonal menu change, every server's scheduling weakness. She had applied for the shift supervisor position twice and had been passed over twice, and she had learned to smile beautifully during both conversations, and then go home and think very hard about why. She stood now at the service station, folding napkins with the focused efficiency of someone thinking about something else entirely. "Funny thing," she said to no one in particular, though she had timed the comment for when 2 junior servers were within earshot, that the bookkeeper just happened to be walking through at exactly the right moment. One of the servers paused. "What do you mean?" Yvette smoothed a napkin fold. "I just think it's interesting. She works downstairs. She never comes through to the private rooms. Then the one night the Sato family is here, she happens to walk in at exactly the right second with exactly the right thing to say." She tilted her head. "People pay a lot of money for access to families like that." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The shift in the air reached Ramona within a week. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcing that she'd noticed. The servers who had previously stopped by her office now slid invoices under the door. The lunch invitations dried up. Conversations in the break room found their natural end when she entered. She sat with it for a few days, the way you sit with a bruise, acknowledging it's there without pressing on it. Then she went back to work. On Thursday, one of the new buses dropped a full tray of glassware near the service elevator. The crash was spectacular. Stafford appeared from somewhere above, and delivered the kind of speech he was known for, precise, withering, and designed to make a person feel they had single-handedly set back the establishment's reputation by approximately a decade. Ramona, who happened to be passing with a stack of invoices, helped the busser pick up the larger pieces of glass in silence. When Stafford swept away, she straightened. "He talks like that because he's scared," she told the busser, a 19-year-old named Cody who was trying very hard not to cry. "The kind of scared that has nowhere to go but sideways." "That's a generous interpretation," Cody managed. "I've been doing his books for 2 years. I know exactly what he's scared of." She handed him the last large shard. "You did nothing wrong. Clean up, go back out, and do your job. Tomorrow you'll be better because you know where that floss lands." Cody nodded, still fragile, but steadied. Yvette, who had watched the whole exchange from the doorway of the linen room, folded her arms and made a small, private decision. 15 days after the private dining room incident, Flavia Sato returned to the Meridian Club alone. She wore a charcoal wool coat and plain silver earrings, and no jewelry that could start a conversation. She had left her driver on the next block. She had told no one where she was going. The hostess at the front desk, a woman named Waverly, who was extremely good at her job, greeted her with professional warmth and regret. They were fully booked for lunch. "I don't mind waiting," Flavia said pleasantly. Waverly took her name. She gave a different one and gestured toward the lobby seating. Flavia sat, folded her coat over her lap, and waited. She waited 18 minutes. During those 18 minutes, 4 staff members passed through the lobby. 2 were carrying things and moving with purpose. One made eye contact and said, "Someone will be right with you," with the practiced guilt of someone who knew they were not going to be the one. One adjusted a flower arrangement without looking at her at all. Nobody was intentionally rude. They were simply overwhelmed. Then a door opened from the direction of the back offices, and Ramona Solis came through with a small stack of printed reports, clearly en route to somewhere else. She stopped when she saw Flavia sitting alone in the lobby. She stopped, and she changed direction. "I'm so sorry. How long have you been waiting?" Flavia looked at her watch. 18 minutes. That's too long. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't an apology on behalf of the establishment. It was simply a statement of fact that something had gone wrong, and that Ramona personally was bothered by it. "Would you like something while you wait? I can bring tea or coffee. The kitchen just pulled a fresh pot." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." There was a pause. "Tea would be lovely," Flavia said. Ramona came back 12 minutes later with a small ceramic pot of chamomile, a cup and saucer, and a plate with 2 almond shortbread cookies, still slightly warm from the pastry station. "I didn't order those," Flavia said. "Our pastry chef made an extra batch this morning." A small smile. "And waiting is genuinely easier with something to eat. I've run the experiment many times." Flavia accepted the tea. She poured it herself and took a slow sip and watched the room. She watched Ramona cross to an elderly couple near the window and help the woman untangle her coat from the chair arm, unhurried, as though she had nothing else in the world to attend to. She watched her kneel beside a small boy who was bored and restless while his parents read the menu, and produce from her cardigan pocket a tiny paper crane she had apparently folded from a receipt while she talked. She watched her thank the busser who brought a water refill by name. Then a man entered through the side door near the service entrance. His coat was clean but thin for the weather, and he hesitated in the threshold with the specific hesitation of someone who understood he might be asked to leave. He approached the front desk and said, in a voice just low enough that it was clearly meant to cost him nothing but pride, that he had enough for a cup of coffee. Waverly was reaching for the menu, already calculating, when Ramona appeared at the man's elbow. "Of course," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This way." She guided him to a small table near the window. She brought him his coffee. And then she brought him a bowl of the tomato soup from the staff lunch menu and set it beside the cup without ceremony. "I didn't order that," he said quietly. "I know. The kitchen made extra." She said it exactly the same way she had said it to Flavia. Not as charity, not as performance, as a plain fact that happened to be true. Flavia set down her cup. For reasons she could not have articulated cleanly, something tightened in her chest. She thought of how many rooms she had walked into in the last 30 years and watched people recalibrate. Their posture, their language, their attention, the moment they understood who she was. She thought of how rarely anyone had ever simply looked at her and seen a woman who might be cold or tired or in need of a decent cup of tea. When a table finally became available and Waverley came to find her, Flavia rose and followed without comment. Ramona escorted her to the table herself. "You knew," Flavia said once they were seated. It wasn't a question. Ramona paused. "I thought I recognized you. I wasn't certain." "And if you had been certain, I would have brought the tea anyway." A beat. "Though I might have been more nervous about the shortbread." Flavia looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wasn't sure you wanted me to." Ramona smoothed her apron. A habit, a small self-steadying gesture. "And if I was wrong about who you were, I would have embarrassed myself trying to impress someone who'd only come in for a quiet lunch." "You took a risk," Flavia said. "I thought your afternoon mattered more." It was the simplest possible answer. Flavia had received, over the course of her life, a great many sophisticated answers. She had received flattery engineered with precision and generosity deployed as strategy. She had been the subject of elaborate kindnesses designed to gain access to her son, her name, her family's resources. This woman had brought her cookies because waiting was hard. That was the whole of it. When Flavia left the restaurant that afternoon, she stopped on the sidewalk for a moment in the brisk air and stood still. She had come to run a test, the kind of test she'd learned to run decades ago after too many disappointments. The results were unambiguous. She told Emilio that evening over dinner at the family house. He listened the way he listened to everything, without interruption, without performing attention, with the complete and particular stillness of a man who understood that most information arrived in the pauses. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She didn't know you the first time," he said. "She may not have been sure the second time either, but she treated you the same. Exactly the same." He looked toward the window. Outside, the city's lights were beginning to separate from the dusk. "People respect the Sato name," Flavia said. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, the way she said things she had considered carefully. "She respected me." Emilio turned that over in his mind. He had heard variations of the idea before, the separation of a name from the person behind it, but he had never heard his mother say it about someone else. His mother, who had been revered and feared and negotiated around for 40 years. Who had outlasted 3 hostile business partners and 2 hostile mayors, and every person who had ever made the error of underestimating her. Who had, Emilio realized now for the first time, probably spent 40 years wondering if anyone would ever notice the difference. He excused himself from dinner early that night. He drove himself without telling anyone and parked on the block behind the Meridian Club. Not to go inside. He had no reason to go inside, he told himself, and then sat in the car for 20 minutes, because he was, at 42, apparently still capable of not being entirely honest with himself. Through the side window of the club's lobby, he watched Ramona Solis finish her shift. He watched her stop to check on a junior server who looked stressed and leave the conversation with that server visibly lighter. He watched her carry her own bag from the coat room instead of asking anyone to get it. He watched her notice an arrangement of chairs near the entrance that had been pushed into an awkward configuration and straighten them, one by one, quietly, with no audience. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and turned up her collar against the evening. Emilio started the car and drove home and sat for a while in the dark of the driveway, thinking about the difference between a name that commanded rooms and a person who made them warmer, and which of those things actually mattered. The invitation arrived at the Meridian Club by messenger on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Ramona Solis, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried. Miss Solis, the Sato Community Foundation is developing a new hospitality initiative for our outreach programs. I believe your perspective would be valuable. Would you be willing to meet? F. Sato. Stafford read the name on the envelope before handing it over. His face went through a complicated sequence of expressions that Ramona observed with the calm of someone who has watched other people realize they have miscalculated. Apparently, he said, handing her the envelope. She opened it, read it twice, and looked up. I'll need Friday afternoon. He blinked. Of course. The Sato Foundation operated out of a converted brownstone 3 blocks from the river. Deliberately understated, the kind of building that announced its seriousness through what it didn't bother to display. Ramona arrived at the correct entrance on the second try, which she suspected was intentional. Flavia met her in the conference room herself. They spent 2 hours talking about the Foundation's community meal programs, 12 locations across the city, serving around 800 people a week, and the gap Flavia had identified between providing meals and providing dignity. They come in and they queue, Flavia said. They receive food in paper containers. They eat at folding tables with no tablecloths, no candles, and no one who looks glad to see them. It makes people feel like a transaction, Ramona said. Exactly. Every person who comes through should feel like a guest. Ramona leaned forward slightly. Not a recipient, a guest. Flavia was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. Emilio arrived 40 minutes into the meeting, having come from the other side of the building. He set a folder on the table without ceremony and greeted Ramona with the particular formality of someone who has thought a great deal about how to greet a specific person and has decided formality is the safest option. We haven't been properly introduced, he said. I'm Emilio. I know who you are, Ramona said. I'm Ramona. I do your club's books. I know who you are, he said. Something shifted very slightly in the air between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing the casual observer would have catalogued. And then they both looked back at the documents on the table, and the meeting continued. She came to the Foundation twice more in October, 3 times in November. The meal program grew from concept to blueprint to a pilot at 2 locations, with real tables and cloth napkins sourced through a vendor, Ramona, found by going through 6 years of dormant supplier accounts and making 14 phone calls. Emilio attended most of the same meetings. He did not explain his attendance. Ramona did not ask for one. What she noticed, in the way she noticed everything, sideways without announcing it, was that he looked at people the way his mother did, completely, without hurry, as if their answers actually mattered to him. She was not accustomed to being looked at that way. In the meantime, Yvette Hollins made a mistake. It was not a malicious mistake, exactly. It was the kind that happens when a person has been telling a version of a story for long enough that they begin to believe it's the whole truth. She mentioned to the wrong person at the wrong time that Ramona had been angling for access to the Sato family since she took the bookkeeping job. The wrong person was a sous chef named Faraday, who happened to be connected to the Sato family in a way that only mattered in certain cities, and which Yvette had not thought to account for. By the following week, Emilio knew the shape of what had been said. He handled it cleanly and without drama. Stafford was informed that the family's continued patronage had implications for the club's staffing decisions. Yvette was not dismissed. Emilio found public punishment distasteful, but the shift supervisor position was filled by someone else, and Yvette understood why, and the understanding was its own sufficient consequence. Ramona was told none of this at the time. She found out months later, incidentally, from Danny the server, who had heard from Cody the busser, who had a gift for information the way some people have a gift for languages. By then, it didn't matter. By then, other things mattered more. One evening in December, after a planning session that had run 2 hours past its scheduled end, Emilio offered to walk Ramona to the subway. It was cold and starting to rain, and he'd said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, as if it were a logistical observation and not a choice. They walked half a block without speaking. The city sounds settled around them. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." That first night, in the private dining room, he glanced at her sideways. "You weren't afraid of her." Ramona was quiet for a moment. The rain was picking up slightly. "I was afraid," she said. "My hands were shaking the whole time." He frowned. "You didn't show it." "Being afraid doesn't mean you have to let it make your decisions." She looked straight ahead. "My mother used to say that fear is useful information. It tells you what matters. But it's not a good navigator." He was quiet. "I was afraid," she said again simply. "I was just more worried about whether your mother had been hurt." Emilio stopped walking. She took a step more before she realized and turned back to look at him. He was standing in the rain with an expression she had not yet learned to read, which was saying something, because she was generally good at reading expressions. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He started walking again. "My mother was right about you." "What did she say?" "That you were the first person in a long time who looked at her and saw a person rather than a position." Ramona thought about that for most of the subway ride home. She thought about the way it had been said. Not as flattery, not as a compliment she was supposed to deflect or return. As a fact he was sharing because he thought she should know it. She looked out the dark window at the tunnel walls rushing past and thought, "I might be in some amount of trouble here." The Sato Foundation's annual gala was held in late February in the grand ballroom of the old city library, a room with 20-foot ceilings and walls lined with books no one read anymore, and the kind of chandeliers that made everyone look slightly better than they were. Ramona stood near the entrance with a clipboard, welcoming guests with the same warmth she'd have used at any establishment that genuinely cared whether people felt welcome. She knew half the names on the list. She knew 2 people's food allergies. She knew which elderly donor needed a chair that wasn't upholstered in the particular shade of green the library had chosen, because of a story that donor had told her in October about a childhood dentist's office. She had arranged for a different chair. Emilio watched her from across the room. He had arrived at a place of honesty about how often he did this. Flavia appeared at his elbow without announcement, as she often did. "Stop watching her from across the room," she said pleasantly. "I'm watching the event." "You've looked at the event twice and Ramona 14 times. I've been counting." He turned his head slightly. "You've been counting." "I had nothing else to occupy me. Go speak to her." "I speak to her regularly." "Emilio," his mother's voice shifted into the register that had been calibrating his behavior since childhood. "Stop speaking to her regularly in meeting rooms about non-profit hospitality initiatives and go speak to her." He went. He found her at the side of the room, helping a volunteer unroll a banner that had gotten slightly twisted. He took the other end without being asked. They unrolled it together. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He looked down at her. "You always say that." You always do things you don't have to. So do you. He passed the end of the banner to the volunteer and looked at her steadily. Ramona. She looked back at him. She had stopped being startled by the way he said her name a while ago. She had not stopped noticing it. Yes? Have dinner with me. Not here. Not for the foundation. Just. He stopped, and the slight pause was the most human thing she had seen him do in months. Dinner. She considered him for a moment. She thought about a woman who had been feared by cities and power structures, and men who controlled significant portions of the economy, and who had spent years wondering if anyone would ever simply be glad to see her. She thought about a man who had grown up inside a name and learned to use it so well that he had maybe forgotten to put something else in its place. She thought about her mother, who had been a practical person with an impractical belief that the right things were usually simple. Yes, she said. Later that evening, when the program reached its formal portion and Flavia took the podium, the room settled into the particular attention that Flavia Sato commanded without asking for it. She thanked the volunteers. She spoke about the meal program. 22 sites now, she announced, and the room applauded. She spoke about what it meant to provide not just food but welcome, to treat every person who walked through a door as someone who deserved to feel expected. Near the end of her remarks, a journalist raised her hand during the brief open floor moment. Mrs. Sato, she said, could you tell us how the Foundation's work began? There's a story going around that it started with a single conversation. Flavia looked across the room at Ramona, who was standing near the side wall with her clipboard and the expression of someone who would very much like to become invisible. It started, Flavia said, with someone who asked if I was hurt before she asked me anything else. She paused. In 30 years, no one had asked that first. The room was quiet. I have been respected because of this family's name for most of my adult life, Flavia continued. People have agreed with me, accommodated me, feared me. They have been generous with me in every way that generosity can be calculated. She found Ramona's eyes across the ballroom. She was simply the first person who respected me. Ramona looked at her clipboard. Her vision had gone slightly imprecise in a way she recognized as inconvenient for someone standing in a public room. Flavia stepped away from the podium and crossed the ballroom floor with the unhurried certainty of someone who has spent a long time being clear about what matters. She reached Ramona and opened her arms, and Ramona, who had lost her mother 8 years ago and her father 2 years after that, and who had spent a long time being quietly competent and hoping it was enough, stepped into the embrace without hesitation. The room applauded. Some people cried. Cody the busser, who had somehow received an invitation through a chain of goodwill too convoluted to trace, stood in the back and was absolutely fine. Emilio stepped off the dais and crossed the room. He waited until his mother and Ramona separated and looked at each other with the expressions of two people who have understood something at the same time. Then he offered Ramona his hand. She looked at it, and at him, and at the city visible through the tall library windows, the lights, and the dark, and all the complicated distance between things that eventually, if the conditions are right and the timing is honest, collapse into something simple. She took his hand. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. There was nothing that needed saying, which was the best possible situation for two people who had been dancing carefully around the center of something for 6 months. The room filled back in around them. The program continued, and the gala went on until nearly midnight. And somewhere in the course of that evening, without announcement or ceremony, the most feared family in the city became something it had been quietly moving toward all along. A family that had simply found one more person who belonged in it. Not because she had sought them, not because she had impressed or maneuvered or planned, but because she had looked at a woman seated alone at a table, powerful, guarded, and inches from broken things, and asked the only question that had ever really mattered. Are you hurt? And meant it.